somewhere in the Philippine Sea, and the USS Indianapolis is sinking. 2 torpedoes from a Japanese submarine have torn the heavy cruiser open below the waterline, and within 12 minutes she has rolled over and gone under, taking hundreds of men down with her. Roughly 900 sailors are left bobbing in the warm, dark Pacific, with no lifeboats, no radio call acknowledged, and no rescue coming for days. What happens next becomes one of the most infamous chapters in American naval history. Sharks, drawn by blood, fuel oil, and the thrashing of exhausted men, begin to circle, then to feed. By the time a passing aircraft spots the survivors on August 2nd, fewer than 320 are still alive. Nobody will ever know exactly how many died from wounds, exposure, salt poisoning, or drowning, and how many were taken by sharks, but the survivors' accounts are enough to fix the image permanently in the American imagination: the ocean as predator, the shark as the embodiment of a sailor's worst nightmare. That nightmare did not stay buried with the war. It surfaced again more than a decade later in a quiet research laboratory on the Gulf Coast of Florida, where a marine biologist and a Navy engineer sat down with a very different question. Not how do we keep sharks away from our men, but what if the shark itself became the weapon? What follows is the story of Project Headgear, a real, federally funded American program that spent over a decade trying to turn one of the ocean's most feared predators into a self-guided bomb. It sounds like the plot of a Cold War spy novel. It was not. It was an actual line item in naval research budgets, conducted by credentialed scientists, documented in a final report that the United States Navy kept classified for nearly half a century. Understanding why it was attempted, how close it came to working, and why it ultimately failed tells us something unexpected about the limits of even the most determined military ingenuity, and about the strange places fear can lead a nation's defense establishment. To understand why anyone thought a shark could be made into a weapon, you first have to understand how badly the United States Navy wanted to solve the opposite problem. Through the Second World War, thousands of American servicemen found themselves adrift in tropical and temperate waters after their ships were sunk or their aircraft went down, often for the first time in naval history, fighting at length over waters that sharks called home. The psychological toll was severe. Quartermasters reported that fear of shark attack was doing as much damage to morale as fear of the enemy. Men refused to ditch aircraft over open water if they could possibly limp home instead. The Navy's response was to develop something to put their minds at ease: a chemical shark repellent, sold under the name Shark Chaser, a small block of copper acetate and black dye that sailors and airmen were told to drop into the water around themselves. It offered psychological comfort more than reliable protection, and the science behind it was thin, but it shipped with virtually every life jacket and life raft kit from 1943 onwards. The Navy poured resources into understanding sharks for one straightforward reason: they were terrified of them, and terrified men make poor combatants. That fear-driven research program had an unintended side effect. By the late 1950s, American institutions such as the Cape Hayes Marine Laboratory in Sarasota, Florida, later renamed the Mote Marine Laboratory, had built up an extraordinary depth of practical shark expertise. They knew how to capture sharks economically, how to keep them alive and healthy in captivity, how to anesthetize them safely, how to fit them with harnesses and instruments, and how their bodies and senses actually worked. None of that expertise existed for any other comparable purpose. Building it from nothing for a brand new species of animal would have taken years and a great deal of money. The infrastructure was already there, paid for and proven, simply waiting for a new application. And the Navy, never an organization to let a sunk research cost go to waste, began to ask a strange new question. If we already understand sharks this well, what else could we do with one? There was also a broader Cold War backdrop that made an idea this strange feel less absurd to the people funding it. The late 1950s and 1960s were a period in which the American defense establishment was willing to entertain almost any avenue that promised an asymmetric edge over the Soviet Union, however unconventional. Exotic biological and behavioral research received serious money, precisely because nobody wanted to be the agency that dismissed the next breakthrough out of squeamishness. Animal-based delivery systems, in particular, held an obvious appeal on paper. No pilot to train, no aircrew to risk, no radar signature to mask, and a creature that, unlike any machine of the period, could already swim silently and indefinitely through hostile water without fuel or maintenance against that backdrop. A program built around steering a fish toward a target did not look like a fringe curiosity so much as a logical, if peculiar, extension of a much wider hunt for cheap, deniable, biologically based weapons. It is that context, as much as the Indianapolis disaster itself, which explains why a credentialed marine biologist and a Navy engineer were able to secure over a decade of continued funding for an idea that, described in isolation, sounds almost like satire. The institution at the center of the new effort was led by Perry W. Gilbert, a respected shark biologist who would go on to direct the Mote Marine Laboratory, working alongside a Navy engineer named James Marion Snodgrass, whose name appears throughout the surviving documentation as the program's principal hardware designer. Officially titled Project Headgear, the work ran, according to the declassified final report, from roughly 1958 through to 1971, funded by the Navy and conducted partly through the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, where Snodgrass's papers are now archived. The ambition, stripped of euphemism, was to convert a living shark into what the report itself describes as something close to a guided munition, an animal that could carry an explosive charge to a target vessel and detonate close enough to cause real damage, all without a human operator anywhere nearby. The mechanism the team devised deserves to be understood on its own terms, because it was genuinely ingenious, even though it ultimately did not work as intended. The shark would not be remotely steered by a human with a joystick, as later news reports sometimes implied. Instead, its course would be set in advance, rather like programming a destination into a very early form of autopilot. The animal wore a headpiece, the Snodgrass head unit, containing a small magnetic compass and associated electronics, connected by implanted electrodes to either side of its head, meaning if the shark began to drift off its programmed heading, the system would detect the deviation and deliver what the report, with a certain clinical understatement, calls a noxious stimulus, an electric shock of between 5 and 25 volts, roughly comparable to the jolt from an electric fence, delivered to the side of the head on whichever side corresponded to the wrong direction. A shark shocked on its left would instinctively swim away from the unpleasant sensation, which meant swimming to the right, correcting its own course, and, in doing so, switching off the current. It was a feedback loop built entirely out of avoidance, the shark essentially steering itself away from pain in a direction the operators had already chosen for it. Early manual versions used a tethered control box, the Snodgrass Control Box Model 3, through which Gilbert reported being able to direct a shark's swimming movements more or less at will. 4 distinct versions of the headgear were developed and tested between the late 1950s and the late 1960s, each one an attempt to refine the same basic principle. There is a detail in the report that captures both the dedication and the slightly absurd lengths the team went to in pursuit of a functioning system. To prove that the headgear hardware itself was sound, separate from any unpredictable shark behavior, Snodgrass tested the electrode and shock system on a willing human volunteer, Gilbert himself. With electrodes implanted in his own shoulders, Gilbert was successfully steered around a swimming pool using the identical stimulus logic intended for the sharks. The equipment worked exactly as designed on a person. On a free-swimming shark, it consistently did not, and working out why became the project's central technical struggle for years. When the time came to test the system on an actual animal swimming freely rather than restrained on a tether, A lemon shark was selected and fitted with the onboard guidance unit for what the report calls field testing. The results were disappointing. The corrective shocks did not produce the clean, predictable course changes the team had achieved with manual control. Researchers spent considerable time adjusting the placement of the electrodes, varying the voltage and frequency of the shock, and altering its duration, without consistent success. Eventually, they identified the underlying problem, and it is almost poetic in its simplicity. As a shark swims, its head naturally yaws from side to side with each beat of its tail, a basic feature of how sharks propel themselves through water. The headgear system had not been designed to account for this constant, rhythmic side-to-side motion, so it kept misreading the animal's heading and delivering corrective shocks at the wrong moments, confusing rather than guiding the shark. A weapon designed around steering a predictable, controllable creature foundered on one of the most ordinary facts of that creature's own anatomy. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The choice of a shark over a dolphin, which one might assume would be the more obvious candidate for animal-based military technology, was deliberate and is explained at some length in the surviving report. Dolphins are demonstrably more intelligent and considerably easier to train through positive reinforcement, and the Navy already operated and continues to operate a separate and far more successful program training dolphins and sea lions to locate underwater mines and detect intruders, work that has been publicly acknowledged for decades. But Gilbert and Snodgrass argued that intelligence was precisely the problem for a one-way mission like theirs. A dolphin, in their own words, has a mind of its own in a way a shark does not. A clever, social animal is far harder to send unflinchingly toward its own destruction than one that can simply be steered by avoidance reflex. There was also a quieter, stealthier argument in the shark's favor. Sharks make no vocalizations of any kind, unlike the clicking, whistling dolphin. And because sharks lack a swim bladder, the gas-filled organ that gives most fish their buoyancy and shows up brightly on sonar, a shark is effectively invisible to passive underwater detection. In a way, a dolphin is not. On paper, a silent, sonar-transparent animal with no real capacity to refuse an order looked like the ideal delivery platform. In practice, the very absence of trainable intelligence that made the shark attractive also made it almost impossible to guide with any precision once it was actually in the water. Project Headgear never reached anything resembling operational deployment, and it is important to be honest about that rather than imply otherwise. There is no evidence in the declassified material, nor in any subsequent reporting, that a shark fitted with this equipment was ever sent against a real target, friendly, hostile, or otherwise. The documented activity is confined to laboratory tanks, swimming pools, and controlled tether tests, plus the single field trial with the lemon shark. This was applied research that never cleared the enormous gap between a working prototype and a usable weapon, and the report's own candor about the yawing problem suggests the team understood that gap remained unbridged. The program limped on for over a decade, through repeated hardware revisions before quietly winding down around 1971 without ever producing a deployable system. Records covering the full extent of testing remain incomplete, and some material may still be withheld. What survives is enough to confirm the program was real and serious, not enough to say precisely how many animals were used or how far testing ultimately progressed in its final years. Project Headgear was far from the only attempt by a 20th century military to weaponize an animal, and setting it alongside its rivals and predecessors shows just how widespread and how often unsuccessful this entire category of thinking really was. The Soviet Union's anti-tank dog program during the Second World War remains the best documented example of an animal genuinely sent into combat as a delivery system. Dogs, trained to associate food with the undersides of tanks, were fitted with explosive packs and a release mechanism, then sent toward advancing German armor. Soviet accounts describe real combat use, but also widespread failure, with dogs frightened by gunfire and engine noise running back toward their own lines rather than toward the enemy, sometimes with disastrous results for the handlers who had trained them. The American war effort had its own parallel curiosity, a wartime proposal known informally as Project Pigeon, in which the behavioral psychologist B.F. Skinner trained pigeons to peck at a screen showing an incoming target, with the pecking motion intended to steer a glide bomb. It achieved a genuinely impressive level of accuracy in testing and was abandoned anyway. Not because it failed technically, but because military reviewers could not bring themselves to trust a guidance system that depended on a bird's continued cooperation when more conventional electronic alternatives, however crude, were becoming available. Project Headgear sits squarely in this tradition, technically inventive, conceptually unsettling, and, ultimately, defeated less by enemy countermeasures than by the unpredictable nature of the animal at its center. Where it differs from the Soviet dogs and Skinner's pigeons is that it never even reached the point of field deployment against a real adversary. It was defeated by basic shark physiology before it ever left the testing tank. The contrast in scale is also worth noting. The Soviet anti-tank dog program reportedly involved many hundreds of trained animals across multiple fronts, and despite its serious failures, it did see genuine combat use, however imperfect. Skinner's Pigeon project reached the stage of a fully engineered glide bomb with a three-bird voting system designed to average out any single animal's error, an impressively sophisticated piece of 1940s engineering in its own right, before funding was withdrawn on the grounds that the concept simply felt too undignified to put into production. Project Headgear, by comparison, appears to have involved a comparatively small number of animals over a much longer span of years, with the bulk of the documented effort spent not on tactics or deployment planning, but on basic, unresolved questions of animal control. None of the three programs can really be called a success in military terms. What separates them is how far each one traveled before the underlying biology, the politics or simple squeamishness brought it to a halt. The actual historical impact of Project Headgear is therefore almost entirely retrospective rather than operational. It changed nothing about how the Cold War was fought, sank no ships, and killed no enemy combatants, because it was never used. Its significance lies elsewhere, in what it reveals about Cold War research culture and about the lingering psychological power of the USS Indianapolis disaster over American naval thinking. A nation that had been traumatized by sharks devouring its own sailors spent public money, over more than a decade, trying to turn that exact source of dread into a weapon of its own, as though defeating the fear meant claiming the predator for itself. The program also stands as a useful corrective to any assumption that classified research is necessarily either successful or sinister in the ways fiction usually imagines. Much of it, as here, is simply difficult, expensive, and quietly shelved when the underlying biology refuses to cooperate. It is also worth pausing on what the project did not directly produce, because the absence is as telling as the presence. There is no evidence that Headgear's specific guidance hardware fed forward into the genuinely successful Navy marine mammal program, which trained dolphins and sea lions for mine detection, and which remains active and publicly acknowledged today. The two efforts ran on parallel tracks, built on the same Cold War appetite for biological solutions, but diverging sharply over which animal and which method of control was actually workable. Where dolphins were trained through reward and partnership, sharks were meant to be steered through avoidance and discomfort, and it is that fundamental difference in approach, not merely a difference in intelligence, that arguably explains why one program matured into a long-running operational success and the other quietly expired as an unresolved engineering puzzle. The project resurfaced into public awareness only because of a chance convergence of interests. The author, Mary Roach, encountered a fragmentary reference to it while researching shark repellents for her book Grunt, and with help from the public records organization Muckrock, successfully petitioned the Navy for a mandatory declassification review, which finally produced the full final report decades after Gilbert and Snodgrass had both died. No fragment of headgear hardware is known to survive in any public museum collection. What remains is paperwork, held partly at Scripps among Snodgrass's archived papers and the handful of journalistic accounts written once the file was finally opened. So, the shark was never made into a weapon. Not really, not in any sense that ever left a Florida testing pool. The compass failed to read the animal's own swimming motion. The electrodes shocked the wrong instinct into the wrong response. The mind the Navy wanted to bypass turned out to be less of an obstacle than the body underneath it, which simply moved the way sharks have always moved, indifferent to American naval ambition. What endured, instead, was an idea, filed away in a classified report for nearly 50 years about how far fear can travel before it runs out of road. From 900 men in the dark water off the Philippines to a swimming pool in Sarasota, where a scientist let himself be shocked to prove his own machine worked, to a lemon shark that simply would not, or could not, be steered. The weapon was never built. The fear that built it was real enough, and it took the United States Navy 13 years and